India's GDP is expected to grow at 7% despite new geopolitical tensions. That's the word coming in from Finance Ministry in its economic review of the past couple of years. Bullish on India's growth and growth story to reach about $7 trillion despite all that is going on geopolitically by 2030. Is that dream feasible, viable? Kartik, you know, if you add up the numbers, we're almost around $4 trillion at the moment, maybe $5 trillion by 27, 28. $7 trillion is not a faraway dream.
Not at all, Shweta. I think, you know, it's simple compound interest. At the end of the day, you know, what really happens is your base, depending on how small or how large it is, it takes that much longer for that 1 trillion to be added. So, you know, interesting data which has been released by the government, which suggests that it took us 60 years to reach our first $1 trillion mark in the economy. 10 years ago, the Indian economy was at $1.9 trillion. This year's close, which is FY24, we should be in the vicinity of 4 trillion, if not at 4 trillion or a little ahead of that. Remember, we were a $3.5 trillion economy in the last financial year, FY23. In fact, some estimates suggest that we were perhaps close to a $3.6, $3.7 trillion economy. So we should be able to close this year at about 4 trillion. That data is only going to come in the month of July. So I'm talking about FY24, which ends on the 31st of March this year. So I think at a $4 trillion base, adding that 1 trillion successively, the number of years is going to take to add that additional 1 trillion is only going to shrink. Now remember what happened with China between 2015 and 2021. Every year China added $1 trillion to its economy. India, on the other hand, took 60 years to add the first trillion, then it took about 7 years to add the second trillion, then it took about 4 years or so to add the third trillion. Now we are likely to add the 4th trillion, you know, again in a span of about 3 years or so. And going forward, when the base increases and as we grow from a you know, from let's say a $3.54 trillion economy, the 5th trillion mark is going to come in maybe in the next 3 years or so. So 27, 28 is when we are likely to be a $5 trillion economy. Successively, every year, if we continue to grow at the same rate, which is estimated at about 7% right now, we should reach every successive consequent trillion much sooner. So if you look at a $4 trillion economy in FY24, and if you were to compound it at a rate of 7%, the 7% growth rate over the next 6 years, which is FY30, indicates that we will be a $6 trillion economy. So I think in the government's estimates, we are looking at maybe 1 or 2 years of either double-digit growth if we can achieve that. Difficult in the geopolitical environment and the geoeconomic environment as it seems right now. But if you're able to clock, let's say, a double-digit growth or in the vicinity of about 9%, 9.5% for any 2 years, then the $7 trillion should not be difficult to achieve. I think these estimates keep coming out, Shweta. You know, some estimates suggest that we'll be a $35 trillion economy by 2047. Some estimates suggest that we will be the world's largest economy at 52 trillion by 2052 or 50 trillion by 2052, and we will overtake China and US both. I think while it's good to estimate and while you believe in the numbers and you believe in the power of compounding, we should not discard two major issues in this growth journey. Number one, of course, this growth has to be equitable, which given India's population of $1.4 billion, I think it's pretty obvious that this growth is not going to be equitable. You will see some sections of society not reaping the benefits of growth as many other sections of society. Secondly, I think the per capita GDP is an important indicator. China's economy at about 2022, at about $18 trillion right now. US, I think, is in the vicinity of about 23, 24 trillion. China at about 18 trillion has the same population as India. So the per capita GDP, when you divide the absolute value of the GDP by the number of people, is much higher than what India's GDP per capita is right now, and will be even when we hit the 7 trillion economy mark and even when we hit the $35 trillion economy mark, right?
So what we're essentially saying is, despite the growth numbers, and they look beautiful when we say India is going to be the third largest economy by the turn of the decade, the per capita GDP just hovering around $2,000 for India and Indians is not enough.
Absolutely. So compare it with US right now, which is the world's largest economy and does not have a population as large as India's. US per capita GDP GDP is in the region of about $86,000. India is just about likely to be in the vicinity of about $2,000.
Right.
China already is about 4 times, 5 times India's per capita GDP. So I think we'll have to look at per capita GDP as one indicator. We should look at equitable growth across all, poverty, multi-dimensional poverty indicators at one level. And at the same time, we should in fact stop competing on these headline-grabbing numbers with either China or with US. I think India needs to set its own priorities right.
Absolutely.
And within these priorities, we are definitely looking at employment. We are looking at becoming the manufacturing hub of the world. We are looking at some sunshine industries like semiconductors, electronics, smartphones, etc., where we want to take the lead. So I think at one level, displacing China is the objective, but I think displacing China should not be the only objective. The objective has to be better employment opportunities for Indians, better per capita income, and a more distributed GDP. And that should take us to whether a 5 or a 7 or a $22 trillion. If it happens in an equitable way, that is where the happiness index in India is likely to shine.
And since we're talking about equitable distribution of wealth, I think that is of course also on Prime Minister's agenda with budget around the corner. Also important to mention, these numbers are coming by the way of an economic review which has been released by Finance Ministry and the Chief Economic Advisor, as opposed to a larger sense of how economy will grow, an economic preview that we get on
That's right. Given that it's an interim budget, in election year, an economic survey is in an interim budget year, in an election year replaced with a look back on the last 10 years.
All right. So